Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Slipknot, We Are Not Your Kind. Overall, I would consider myself to be a fan of Slipknot and their music. I like the majority of the material that they've put out to some extent. I wouldn't say I'm a crazy big fan of them or anything like that, but I do like their music and I was looking forward to hearing this new album of theirs. Overall, I have to say that this is a pretty solid record from the guys. There's not a lot of problems that I really have with this thing. On this project, Slipknot really give us a nice slice of their typical style, occasionally mixed up with some new sounds as well. I think the band strikes a really nice mix of giving people the traditional sound that they like to hear from the band and some new stuff to keep things interesting. There's just enough of both of those so that old fans that like the old stuff and the typical sound of the band will enjoy this project to some extent, and those that are looking for maybe something a bit new or a bit more forward-thinking from this band will also have tracks to enjoy here as well. Out of all the songs on this thing that try something a bit new for the band, my favorite, and probably just my favorite track overall on this album, has to be Spiders. This song that brings this very creepy atmosphere with its keyboards. It's just a lot scarier than I would expect from Slipknot to be doing, which, yeah, I know the band typically has their whole costume getup and this kind of creepy vibe going throughout much of their music, but I think this track is probably the closest they come, or one of the few instances where they come really close to actually coming across a bit scary and creepy in their music, and as a result, this track is just an instant standout for me. It's a great song. The track My Pain is another song on here that I didn't really expect to hear from the band, but one that I think is pulled off pretty nicely, essentially being this longer, spacier, more atmospheric cut that I didn't really see Slipknot doing on a project like this, but I think it's one they pull off with a lot of grace at the end of the day. Furthermore, I think the track Liar's Funeral is another highlight on this thing, especially with how the band balances some of these slower moments on this thing with their more typical aggressive moments as well. And it's not just done in the more typical Slipknot or just, typical fashion where maybe you'll have a more aggressive verse followed by a more melodic chorus. You do have some instances of that here on this project, but A Liar's Funeral switches things up a bit more and makes it a bit more interesting. Outside some of the odder tracks on this thing that I really like, there are many moments on this project where Slipknot is just kind of doing their more typical thing, but doing it in a way that just sounds really nice, and where they're just excelling at it to the point where the fact that it's a bit typical doesn't really matter anymore because it's just being performed so well. Tracks like Birth of the Cruel, for example, which is just this very straightforward, aggressive track, is a really fine example of this. The song Narrow Forte is another one which has that really aggressive verse, catchy, more melodic hook dynamic that I mentioned earlier. I think it's pulled off especially well here on this track because on the hook, not only are you getting some more melodic, catchy parts from Corey and his vocals, but he's also kind of switching back and forth on this hook between his more melodic and clean singing voice and his more aggressive shouts, and it makes for just a really enjoyable and different listen from a lot of the other tracks on this project. A lot of the more typical tracks on this thing bring to the table what you would want to hear in a more typical Slipknot song. Very aggressive deliveries on Corey's part, mixed in with some more melodic deliveries, especially during the hooks as well. Very aggressive in-your-face instrumentation. But despite the fact that, as I said before, a lot of what you get here on these songs can be a bit typical for the band with how it's structured, the performances here are great enough that, the fact that it's a bit typical doesn't really even matter anymore. The quality songwriting and the energy that the band brings to the table on these tracks makes up for the more typical formatting of them and just makes for some really solid songs. While I enjoy the majority of this record overall, there are some minor problems that I have with this thing that do on occasion make for a less than desirable listening experience. Probably the biggest one I have is that I think this record is a bit longer than it needs to be. This album runs a little over an hour in length, but I think it could have been shortened by a good few minutes to make it a bit more concise and punchy. Some of the songs on this thing I think will run a bit longer than they need to. Even some of the songs that I mentioned earlier that I enjoy, I think they could have been shortened a bit more and retooled just to be a bit more focused sounding, and it would have made for a shorter, more concise listen. I also think that there are some songs on this thing that maybe just are a bit too forgettable to really need to stay on the album, like Red Flag, for example. Not a bad song in its own right, just the most typical song on the record, I feel, and I think if you were to cut it, you'd still really have a full album experience that wouldn't be hindered by this track's disappearance. The first full song that you get on this thing, Unsated, is another track here that I kind of have mixed opinions on. I do think that the overall structure of what this track is trying to go for is pretty decent. I do like the hook on this track. I think it's pretty catchy. However, I'm just not the biggest fan of the choir vocals that are mixed into this track too. They just sound a bit too bombastic, I think, for what this track really is at the end of the day, which is the more straightforward, typical Slipknot track. It just makes the entire song feel like it's trying to be a bit grander than it needs to be, and it just feels a bit off-putting as a result of that. Not a terrible song or anything, but a kind of weak start overall to this album. You do also have, on occasion on this album, some interlude-type tracks that, you know, I don't really feel like add a ton to the project. They're not the worst interlude tracks, and they don't go on for so long that it starts to become annoying or anything, but I still feel like they could have either been cut from the record or reworked into some other songs to make the project just a bit more concise. Some pacing issues aside, I do think that this album is a really solid listening experience, and definitely one that you should have on your radar if you're a fan of Slipknot, or if you're just a metal fan in general. Like I said previously, the band on this project is hitting this nice sweet spot between doing the more typical sound and branching out and experimenting a bit more, to the point where I think fans that want both of those things, or either one of those things, will still get some enjoyment from this album. So overall, I would definitely recommend this project. It's not quite one of my favorites of the year or anything, but it's still a really good album. But overall, that is just my own personal opinion concerning this project. If you happen to disagree with me, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on this album in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. If you enjoy that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.